nuclear blackmail. Britain has possessed nuclear weapons for just over 50 years and is laying plans, as Tim has just told us, to keep them going for the next half-century. The government has explained that their core argument for replacing Trident is that if Britain were to divest itself of this weapon, then a state that did possess nuclear weapons and had hostile intent might pose a grave threat to our vital interests, or at least prevent us from intervening as a force for good, as we might otherwise wish. If this happened, we should have no option but to submit. Conventional capabilities would not suffice. Only possession of our own nuclear weapon can give us the freedom to confront, I quote, blackmail and acts of aggression against our vital interests by nuclear-armed opponents. Put in these stark terms, the argument carries a certain ring of conviction. The aim of this talk is to show that it is far from being the whole story. The first and obvious point is that of the 188 states party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, all but 5 have committed themselves to maintaining non-nuclear weapon status. If this makes them all potential victims of nuclear blackmail, they don't seem to be unduly worried. Many of them have the economic, industrial and scientific capacity to become nuclear weapon states if they so wish, but have chosen not to. A huge majority of states has voluntarily accepted non-nuclear weapon status and seems to suffer no disadvantage from that effect. They don't seem to suffer from the fear of blackmail and acts of aggression against their vital interests by one of the 8 countries that have these weapons, or by any others who might acquire them. Why should Britain be any different? A similar point can be made from the other side. It's not clear that any of the possessor states has derived benefit from its weapons by way of coercing a non-nuclear weapon state. America was defeated by North Vietnamese in 1975 and backed down in the face of casualties on many other fronts, most notably the Tehran hostage crisis 1980, Beirut 1983, Mogadishu 1993. The Soviet Union was defeated by the Afghans. In none of these cases were their nuclear weapons any help to the possessors. Britain cannot claim to have derived any direct security benefit from the possession of nuclear weapons. British nuclear weapons didn't deter Argentina from attempting to annex the Falkland Islands in 1982, nor did they help Britain to recover them, despite the belief that the Polaris submarine was patrolling the South Atlantic. Since possession of nuclear weapons for the past 50 years has not done Britain any demonstrable good, what does this tell us about the next 50 years? It's impossible to predict the political context for a period extending to the middle of the 21st century. The focus of American interest may have shifted decisively towards the Pacific Rim. The Russians and Chinese may have become hegemonic powers in their own right, and the number of nuclear weapon states may have doubled or may have halved. One can distinguish 2 possible situations. The first is where the United States, while possibly sympathetic to Britain's position, is not prepared to commit to her nuclear protection, bearing in mind that this could place American forces or homeland at risk of retaliation. The second is where the United States is actively opposed to the position taken by Britain. Let's take the latter first. How likely is it that a Prime Minister would act in defiance of the United States? The last time that Britain took military action in the teeth of opposition from America was at Suez in November 1956. America checkmated this action within days by means of financial, economic and political pressure. Does anyone seriously imagine that the United States would not act similarly if Britain were contemplating the use of a nuclear weapon against the wishes of the United States? But what about the situation where America, while not actively opposing British action, is unwilling to support it? Until 1942, Britain had to face the existential threat from Hitler by herself. President Roosevelt, our best friend and ally, uttered kind words and gave financial support. But until forced in by the Japanese, he kept the United States firmly out of the struggle, even when it looked as though we might go under. Perhaps it is unlikely that this would ever happen again, but it might. So, who knuckles under to nuclear blackmail? In June 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded the surface route into to West Berlin, no doubt expecting to achieve control of the whole city, despite the fact that it was defended by substantial American, British and French garrisons, and that the United States then possessed nuclear weapons but the Soviet Union did not. And so far from threatening a military, still less a nuclear response, the Allies decided to resupply West Berlin by means of massive airlift. The airlift was successful, blockade failed, and was lifted in May 1949, and the Soviets were humiliated. In July 1950, at the very beginning of the Korean War, President Truman ordered 10 nuclear-configured B-29s to the Pacific. He warned the Chinese that the United States would take whatever steps are necessary to stop Chinese intervention, and said that nuclear weapons had been under active consideration. The Chinese by that time were still several years short of acquiring their own nuclear weapons. By late November, the Americans had made substantial incursions into North Korea. The Chinese then struck, completely overran several South Korean divisions, and attacked the flank of the remaining UN forces. The ensuing defeat of the US 8th Army resulted in the longest retreat of any American military unit in history. This was a major defeat for the Americans, and plainly their effective nuclear blackmail had not dissuaded the Chinese from inflicting it. Saddam Hussein was not deterred from invading Kuwait in 1990 by fear of American nuclear weapons, although he had none himself. It's often been suggested that the reason Saddam did not use his chemical weapons to stave off such a defeat was that he'd been warned repeatedly by the Americans, Israeli and British of dire consequences if he did so. One might question whether the United States would actually have used nuclear weapons in response to a chemical attack. Whether the nuclear component of this was decisive must remain a speculation. A fourth example is provided by Chinese threats against Taiwan. The nearest that matters came to a showdown was in 1996, when China began conducting military exercises near Taiwan and launched several ballistic missiles over the island. This was done in response to the possible re-election of the then President Lee Teng-hui. The United States, under President Clinton, sent 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the Taiwan Straits. China quietly backed down. It's widely believed that China's aggressive act, far from intimidating the Taiwanese people, gave Lee a boost that pushed his share of votes over 50%. None of these instances is unambiguous, but all can be read as examples where a non-nuclear weapon state, faced with threats of attack by a nuclear weapon state, has gone ahead exactly as if such a threat didn't exist. This is not to argue that a non-nuclear Britain could never be constrained in its actions vis-à-vis a nuclear adversary by fear of nuclear blackmail. Conceivably it might be that we failed to unearth a single unequivocal precedent. What is clear is that for Britain to submit under these circumstances is a far from foregone conclusion. An insurance policy, provided the cost is not exorbitant, against a low risk but devastating event is not unreasonable. In a highly volatile security environment, where nuclear proliferation is a continuing danger, there may be some comfort in believing in such insurance. But in no other area of military provision is the justification of general insurance against the unforeseen accepted. At the moment when the defence budget for equipment is heavily overdrawn, with the recession casting a shadow many years ahead, and with other important areas of procurement permanently ring-fenced, similar to aircraft carriers, it's time to reflect on how thin the justification of Trident really is, and to evaluate it fairly and rigorously against the opportunity costs, about which we're going to hear after lunch. The purpose of this has been to examine the statement, we can only deter threats of nuclear blackmail in future through the continued possession of nuclear weapons. Shown, I hope, that this is far from being the brass-bound certainty for which it's commonly taken. The precedents don't support it, it's a partial truth at best, and needs to be carefully balanced against the many other factors which will determine the food security of this kingdom.